I had exactly 60 seconds before the check folder hit the linen and the girl in the red dress turned Baek Dohyun into a ghost. My thumb pressed into the leather, smearing the ink on the note hidden inside. The paper felt like a live wire against my palm, ready to strike. Around me, Sora Lounge breathed with the heavy, expensive scent of amber and sandalwood. It was the sound of $1,000 a night habit, the rhythmic clink of crystal, the low thrum of a bass line through the floorboards, and the velvet rustle of secrets being kept. Outside, Los Angeles was a blur of smog and neon, but in here, the air was thick, pressurized, and deadly. I walked toward the corner booth like a woman stepping onto a gallows. Dohyun sat with the casual, terrifying stillness of a predator at rest. He was draped in charcoal silk, his silver watch catching the dim light every time he adjusted his cufflinks. His face was a mask of cold elegance, sharp cheekbones and eyes that seemed to see through the walls. And then there was Kelly. She leaned into his space, her blonde hair spilling over his shoulder like a waterfall of silk. In her red gown, she looked like a masterpiece, her laughter light and melodic as she touched his hand. To the room, she was a woman in love. To me, she was a recurring nightmare. Because 2 years ago, I wasn't at Sora. I was a ghost behind the bar at the Ember Room. I remembered the way she'd looked in a different dark room, stripped of the socialite persona. I remembered the cold, clinical way she'd mapped out a syndicate hit while I was restocking the top shelf gin 5 feet away. She didn't use Italian or Russian back then, she used the precise, shorthand language of an infiltrator. The target is comfortable. The perimeter is soft. Bring the silencers to the service entrance. She hadn't seen me then, no one ever sees the help. But I had seen her. And I knew that in 60 seconds, when that check hit the table, the girl in red wouldn't be reaching for her purse. She'd be reaching for the end of Baek Dohyun's life. The air in Sora Lounge was too thin, a vacuum created by the sheer gravity of Table 7. I adjusted the heavy silver tray in my grip, my knuckles white, as I watched Kelly Shearer laugh. It was a beautiful sound, light, melodic, and entirely fabricated. 2 years ago, I had been a ghost in the Ember Room, a private club so exclusive the city's elite paid just to be ignored there. I was a bar back then, moving through the shadows with bags of ice and crates of gin. To the guests, I was a shadow. To Kelly, I was non-existent. I had stood 5 feet away from her in a darkened VIP booth as she leaned over a map of the city, her voice dropping the socialite lilt for the cold, clipped tone of a strategist. She hadn't been talking about charity galas, she had been talking about clearing the board for a syndicate takeover. I had quit the next day, haunted by the clinical way she'd ordered a man's disappearance between sips of a dirty martini. I thought I'd buried that life. I thought I was safe in the upscale, legitimate hum of Sora. But seeing her here, draped over Baek Dohyun like a silk shroud, changed everything. Dohyun was a different kind of monster, principled, powerful, and currently walking into a buzzsaw he couldn't see. I pulled a receipt from my apron, my hands trembling. Every instinct I had, the invisibility complex, that had kept me safe for 24 years, screamed at me to stay in the kitchen. Don't look at them. Don't be a witness. Just serve the water and walk away. But if I walked away, Dohyun would be dead by midnight, and Kelly would move on to her next fiancé, with another empire in her pocket. I grabbed a ballpoint pen from the wait station. My breath hit the back of my throat in jagged hitches. I wasn't a hero, I was a girl who knew too much and had finally run out of places to hide. I scribbled the 7 words that would act as a death warrant for my old life. The clock was ticking. I had 45 seconds before the dessert spoons hit the table. I folded the note, tucked it into the leather checkbook, and stepped out of the shadows. My invisibility was about to end. The gold embossed check folder felt like a slab of lead in my hand. I moved with the practiced, rhythmic grace of a woman who had spent years mastering the art of being part of the furniture, weaving through the scent of expensive cigars and the sharp, metallic tang of the city's elite. At Table 7, the air was different. It didn't just hum, it throbbed with the weight of Baek Dohyun's presence. Dohyun didn't look up as I approached. He was a man accustomed to the world bending to his silence. Beside him, Kelly was a vision of curated perfection, her hand draped possessively over his forearm, her laughter a silvery chime that felt like a serrated blade against my nerves. I could see the faint pulse in her neck, steady and calm, the heartbeat of a woman who had orchestrated dozens of endings and never lost a night's sleep. "Your check, sir," I murmured. My voice was a flat, service industry neutral, betraying nothing of the roar in my ears. I set the leather folder down on the white linen, positioned precisely by his left hand. For a heartbeat, my fingers brushed the edge of the table, and I felt the heat radiating from him. I didn't wait for a thank you. I didn't stay to see his reaction. I turned and retreated into the shadows of the service station, my breath hitching in my chest. From my vantage point behind the polished mahogany of the bar, I watched. Dohyun's movements were deliberate. He opened the folder, his dark eyes scanning the total, then paused. He didn't flinch. He didn't look around the room. But I saw the subtle shift in his posture, the way his shoulders went rigid, the way his thumb traced the edge of the receipt where I'd scrawled those 7 words, "She isn't who she says she is." Beside him, Kelly tilted her head, her smile faltering by a fraction of a millimeter. "Everything all right, darling?" she asked, her voice honeyed and lethal. Dohyun closed the folder with a soft, final thud. He slid his black Amex into the slot without a word, his expression an impenetrable mask of granite. He didn't look at her. Instead, his gaze drifted upward, cutting through the amber light of the lounge until it locked onto mine. It wasn't the look of a customer. It was the look of a man who had just found a crack in his foundation and was deciding whether to repair it or burn the whole house down. My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird desperate for flight. I had spent my life trying to be invisible, trying to stay out of the blood-soaked history of the Ember Room. But as Dohyun handed the checkbook back to a busboy and stood up, adjusting his jacket with a terrifying, quiet precision, I knew the shadows weren't going to hide me anymore. The countdown hadn't stopped. It had just changed direction. And now, it was counting down to the moment I would have to face the monster I'd just provoked. The cool night air of Los Angeles usually felt like freedom, but tonight it felt like a trap. I walked fast, my sneakers squeaking against the damp pavement of the employee parking lot, my heart still performing a frantic solo against my ribs. I just needed to reach my Honda, lock the doors, and disappear into the gridlock of the 405. I was 10 feet from my car when the world shifted. A sleek, matte black SUV materialized from the shadows of the alleyway, cutting off my path with a predatory smoothness. The passenger door opened before the vehicle had even fully stopped. Mariah Williams. The voice wasn't a question, it was a command. A man stepped out. He was built like a mountain in a tailored tactical vest, his face a map of scars and indifference. He didn't reach for a weapon, but he didn't have to. The sheer gravity of his presence anchored me to the spot. "Mr. Beck would like to settle his tab," the man said. I looked at the tinted rear windows. I couldn't see him, but I could feel him, the cold, pressurized aura of Baek Dohyun. My invisibility had officially expired. My flaw, that instinct to hesitate and hope the world would forget I existed, kept me frozen for a second too long. Before I could turn to run, the mountain was beside me, a heavy hand guiding me toward the open door. The interior of the SUV smelled of expensive leather and something sharp, like ozone before a storm. I slid into the plush seat, and the door clicked shut with a sound that reminded me of a coffin closing. Dohyun was sitting in the corner, shrouded in the dim glow of the city light streaking past the window. He was alone, Kelly was nowhere to be seen. He didn't look at me at first. He was staring at the leather checkbook folder from the restaurant, now resting open on his lap. "The Ember Room," he said softly, his voice a low vibration that seemed to hum in my very marrow. "A place where people go to lose things. Money. Secrets. Lives." He finally turned his head. His eyes were dark, searching, and terrifyingly intelligent. He held up the receipt I'd signed with my warning. "You're a server at Sora, Mariah. You have a clean record. You're a nursing student with a father in a private care facility you can barely afford," he recited, his gaze never wavering. "So tell me, How does a girl who works so hard to be invisible know the exact signature of a syndicate cleaner I've lived with for 3 years? The car took a sharp turn, heading toward the hills, away from the safety of the crowds. The stakes were no longer about a tip or a shift. I was sitting in the dark with a monster, and the only thing keeping me alive was the truth I had tried so hard to forget. I didn't just see her, I whispered, my voice finally finding its strength. I heard her. And if you're heading home tonight, you're walking into a house that's already been hollowed out. Dohyun leaned forward, the light of a passing street lamp illuminating the cold hunger in his expression. Then you had better start talking, Mariah. Because if you're lying, you'll find out that being unseen is a luxury I'm about to take away. The SUV climbed the winding roads of the Hollywood Hills, the city lights below shrinking into a shimmering carpet of broken glass. We pulled through a gate that looked more like a fortress entrance than a residential driveway. Dohyun's high-rise estate was a monolith of steel and tinted windows, a cold monument to a man who lived at the top of a food chain he'd built himself. Once inside, the silence of the penthouse was deafening. Dohyun led me into a sprawling study lined with dark wood and monitors that flickered with security feeds. He didn't offer me a seat. He went straight to a wall safe, keyed in a code, and pulled out a leather-bound ledger, the physical heart of his empire. I've known there was a leak for months, he said, spreading the ledger across a massive obsidian desk. Shipments seized in San Pedro. Enforcers disappearing in Koreatown. I looked at my captains, my rivals, even my own blood. But I never looked at the woman in my bed. He turned a monitor toward me. It showed a grainy, high-angle shot of a garden terrace. Kelly was there, sitting alone, her face illuminated by the glow of a burner phone. Her expression wasn't that of a fiancée, it was the cold, calculating mask of a technician. She's been careful, Dohyun murmured, his voice laced with a lethal edge of betrayal. But she didn't account for a ghost from the Ember Room. I stepped closer to the desk, my hands still trembling as I looked at the names and dates in his ledger. The invisibility that had always been my shield felt different here, it felt like a weapon. I began to point at the dates, matching them with the whispers I remembered from 2 years ago. The night I saw her at the bar, she wasn't alone. She was with a man named Vane, I said, the memories rushing back with terrifying clarity. They weren't talking about love. They were talking about hollowing out the center. They mentioned a date, the 14th. That was the night your warehouse in Long Beach burned, wasn't it? Dohyun froze. His gaze moved from the ledger to me, his eyes narrowing as he connected the dots I was providing. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something other than coldness in his expression. It was respect. She's not just a spy, Mariah. She's the architect of a coup, he whispered. The syndicate isn't just trying to kill me. They're using her to map out my entire infrastructure so they can move in the moment I'm gone. He slammed the ledger shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the sterile room. You're the only one who can identify her handlers. You're the only one who has seen the faces behind the curtain. The stakes had shifted again. I wasn't just a witness anymore, I was a living map of his enemies' movements. As Dohyun stepped toward me, his presence overwhelming and dark, I realized that my old life as a server was truly dead. I was part of the ledger now. The sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Dohyun's breakfast nook was too bright, too cheerful for the Cold War being waged at the table. I stood off to the side, a white linen napkin draped over my arm, wearing a borrowed server's vest that felt like a suit of lead. My instructions were simple: play the part. Be the invisible girl again. Dohyun sat at the head of the table, his face a masterpiece of practiced indifference. Opposite him, Kelly was the picture of elegance in a cream-colored silk robe, her hair perfectly tousled. She was spreading marmalade on a piece of toast with the delicate precision of a surgeon. "You're quiet this morning, Beck," Kelly said, her voice like honey with a hidden sting. She glanced at me, her blue eyes tracking my movement as I stepped forward to refill her coffee. "And we have a new face in the house. Since when do we bring the Sora staff home? The regular girl is out." "Mariah is exceptional," Dohyun replied, his voice level. He didn't look at me, but I felt the weight of his attention. I wanted things to be perfect today. We have much to discuss regarding the wedding. I felt Kelly's gaze linger on me as I poured. The steam from the coffee rose between us, a thin veil. For a split second, her mask slipped. She didn't recognize me from the Sora Lounge, she recognized me from the Ember Room. I saw the shadow of a memory cross her face, a flicker of cold realization that I was the ghost who had overheard her secrets 2 years ago. Exceptional, Kelly repeated, her smile not reaching her eyes. She reached out, her fingers brushing my wrist as I set the silver pot down. Her skin was ice cold. You look familiar, Mariah. Have we met before? Perhaps in a different life? My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but I kept my gaze down, my voice a steady whisper. I have a common face, ma'am. People often think they've seen me. Do they? Kelly's grip on my wrist tightened just enough to be a threat. I find that hard to believe. You have the eyes of someone who sees far too much. Dohyun cleared his throat, the sound sharp as a gunshot. The toast is getting cold, Kelly. Focus on your breakfast. She let go, her laugh a sharp, brittle sound. The psychological chess match had begun. She knew I was a threat, and I knew she was a killer, and between us sat the man who held both our lives in his hands. As I retreated to the shadows of the kitchen, I realized the brunch wasn't just a meal, it was a countdown. And the air in the room was already starting to burn. The estate's formal garden was a labyrinth of manicured boxwoods and shadows, silvered by a moon that looked as cold as the woman hunting me. Dohyun had gone to take a call, a deliberate opening in his armor to see if Kelly would take the bait. I was the lure, sent out under the guise of clearing tea service from the stone terrace. My invisibility was no longer a shield, it was a target. I could feel her before I saw her, a shift in the air, the faint, cloying scent of her expensive perfume cutting through the smell of damp earth. You're very good, Mariah, Kelly's voice drifted from the darkness of a willow tree. She stepped into the moonlight, the cream silk of her robe replaced by a dark, form-fitting tactical jacket. The transition was jarring, like seeing the skeleton beneath the skin. The shy server, the diligent student. You almost had me convinced. I didn't run. My breath hitched, my old instinct to freeze screaming at me, but I remembered the Ember Room. I remembered that predators rely on their prey's paralysis. I backed away slowly, my hand surreptitiously reaching into the pocket of my apron, gripping the heavy silver shears I'd lifted from the potting shed. I know who you are, Kelly, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I know about Vane. I know about the 14th. She laughed, a short, sharp sound that didn't reach her eyes. She drew a suppressed pistol with a fluid, practiced motion. Knowing is a death sentence in this world. You should have stayed invisible. She moved with terrifying speed, closing the distance between us. I didn't try to outrun her, I used the labyrinth. I dived between a gap in the high hedges, a path too narrow for someone of her height to navigate quickly. I heard the soft thwip of a bullet burying itself in the wood behind me. I was small, I was fast, and I knew how to move through spaces people ignored. I scrambled through the dirt, looping back toward the fountain. Kelly followed, her footsteps heavy and frustrated. She expected me to cower, she didn't expect me to hunt. As she rounded the corner of the fountain, I didn't retreat. I dropped low, thrusting the heavy shears between her ankles. She tripped, the pistol skittering across the marble. I didn't wait to see her get up. I sprinted toward the house, screaming Dohyun's name. I wasn't just a witness anymore. I had survived the infiltrator. And as Dohyun emerged from the shadows of the terrace, his own weapon drawn and a dark, satisfied grin on his face, I realized the trap had finally snapped shut. Not on me, on her. The shipping yard at the port of Los Angeles was a graveyard of rusted steel and salt air. Under the flickering amber glow of the industrial floodlights, the massive shipping containers looked like the ribs of a fallen beast. Dohyun stood in the center of the clearing, his long black coat snapping in the wind, his silhouette a sharp contrast to the chaotic geometry of the cranes behind him. I was positioned 30 yards away, tucked into the shadow of a crane's massive gear assembly. I wasn't just watching anymore, I was the pivot point. In my ear, a tiny comms piece crackled with the steady breathing of Dohyun's elite security team, hidden among the stacks. "They're here," I whispered, my voice caught by the wind. 2 black sedans drifted into the yard, their headlights cutting through the fog like searchlights. They stopped 20 feet from Dohyun. The doors opened in perfect synchronization, and a man I hadn't seen in 2 years stepped out. Vane. He looked exactly as he had at the Ember Room, sharp, clinical, and entirely devoid of a soul. Beside him, Kelly stepped out of the second car, her hands zip-tied in front of her as part of the charade. She looked battered, playing the role of the captured fiancée to perfection. "You're late, Beck," Vane said, his voice carrying easily over the crashing of the distant surf. "I expected a man of your reputation to be more eager to ransom his heart." "My heart isn't for sale, Vane," Dohyun replied, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "And neither is my territory." Vane signaled, and 4 men with submachine guns fanned out behind him. The arrangement was simple. You sign over the San Pedro Manifest, and the girl lives. Don't make this difficult. This was the moment. The invisibility I had hated my whole life became the very thing that would break them. While their eyes were locked on Dohyun, I moved. I didn't run, I flowed through the shadows I knew so well, navigating the narrow gaps between the containers until I was directly behind Vane's perimeter. I reached the emergency release lever for the overhead crane, the one Dohyun had told me would be the signal. My hands didn't shake. The nursing student who feared her own shadow was gone, replaced by the woman who had survived the garden. I pulled the lever. The massive steel spreader bar above the sedans dropped 6 feet with a deafening metallic screech. It was the only distraction Dohyun needed. He drew his weapon in a blur of motion, and the shipyard erupted into a symphony of gunfire and shattering glass. I didn't cower. I stayed in the dark, watching as the masquerade finally fell away. Kelly didn't wait to be rescued. The moment the shooting started, she snapped her ties, which were nothing more than stage props, and lunged for a weapon. But she wasn't looking at Dohyun. She was looking for me. The war had moved from the shadows of the Ember Room to the cold light of the docks, and the blood on the concrete was finally going to belong to the right people. The industrial floodlights of the shipping yard hummed, a low-frequency vibration that set my teeth on edge as the smoke from the initial exchange of gunfire began to settle. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and salt. In the center of the clearing, the masquerade finally shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Dohyun stood over a fallen gunman, his weapon lowered but not holstered, his gaze fixed on Kelly. She wasn't playing the victim anymore. The zip ties lay on the concrete like discarded snakeskins. She stood near Vane, a sleek, compact submachine gun gripped in her hands with the familiarity of an old friend. The transformation was complete. The blushing fiancée had been replaced by the high-level syndicate cleaner I had seen 2 years ago. "You should have killed me in the garden, Kelly," Dohyun said, his voice a low, terrifying calm that cut through the sound of the distant sirens. "I wanted to see the look on your face when your empire crumbled," Kelly spat, her voice no longer honeyed. It was the sound of a blade scraping stone. She looked toward the shadows where I was hidden. "And I wanted to find that little rat from the Ember Room. The one who thinks she can play in our world." "She isn't playing," Dohyun replied, stepping into her line of sight to shield my position. "She's the reason you're standing in a graveyard instead of a throne room." Vane surged forward, his face a mask of cold fury, but a sniper's red dot appeared on his chest, freezing him in place. Dohyun's security had the perimeter. It was over, but Kelly wasn't a woman who accepted defeat. She pivoted, firing a wild burst toward the crane where I was perched. The bullet sparked against the steel gears inches from my head. For a second, the old Mariah, the girl who wanted to be invisible, screamed to stay down. But the woman who had survived the night stood up. I stepped out from the shadow of the machinery, the cold harbor wind whipping my hair across my face. "I'm right here, Kelly," I called out, my voice steady and clear. She turned, her eyes widening in a mixture of shock and hatred. In that moment of hesitation, Dohyun moved. He didn't fire, he lunged, disarming her with a brutal, efficient strike that sent her weapon skittering toward the edge of the pier. I walked down the metal stairs of the crane, my boots clanging against the rungs. When I reached the concrete, I didn't stop until I was standing 5 feet from her. Kelly was pinned to the ground by one of Dohyun's men, her face pressed into the grit. She looked up at me, the infiltrator, finally unmasked and undone. "I remember everything you said that night at the bar," I said softly, looking down at the woman who had tried to turn me into a loose end. "You thought I was part of the furniture. You thought I was nobody. But a nobody is the only person who can see everything." Dohyun stepped beside me, his hand resting briefly on my shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of ownership, but of partnership. The truth of the Ember Room had been laid bare, and as the police lights finally began to strobe against the rusted containers, I realized the girl who worked at Sora Lounge was gone. The unmasking wasn't just hers, it was mine. The air at Sora Lounge was different now. The scent of expensive oud and amber remained, but the oppressive weight that used to make me feel like a ghost had evaporated. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the neon pulse of Los Angeles. I wasn't wearing a server's apron. Tonight, I wore a dress of midnight silk that shimmered like oil on water, and the staff moved around me with a quiet, deferential grace. "Regretting the change of scenery?" Dohyun's voice was a low vibration behind me. He stepped into my space, his presence as steady and grounding as the foundation of the building itself. He didn't touch me yet, but I could feel the heat radiating from his tailored suit. "I'm regretting that I didn't do it sooner," I said, turning to face him. The city glittered behind him, a throne of lights for a man who had survived a coup and come out stronger. Kelly was gone, her name scrubbed from the ledgers, her betrayal a cautionary tale whispered in the dark corners of the underworld. My father was safe, moved to the best private facility in the country, his medical debt settled by a man the world called a monster. "You're not a ghost anymore, Mariah," Dohyun murmured, his dark eyes tracing the line of my jaw. "The world sees you now." "They see what you want them to see," I countered, a small, knowing smile tugging at my lips. "But I know the difference. I used to be the girl who heard too much and did nothing. Now, I'm the woman who ensures the right people are listening." He reached out then, his thumb grazing my cheek. "I made you a target. I dragged you into a war that wasn't yours." "No," I said, leaning into his touch. "You gave me the power to finish a war that started the moment I walked into the Ember Room. You made me a survivor. There's a difference." He kissed me then, a slow, deep seal on a partnership built on blood and a single, frantic note. Outside, the city of Los Angeles continued to roar, a beautiful, violent machine that never slept. Underneath the glamour, the enemies would always be circling, looking for a crack in the glass. But they wouldn't find it here. I had spent my life trying to be invisible, fearing the monsters who ruled the night. Now, I stood beside the most dangerous one of them all, not as a witness, but as his equal. The young server who had slipped a note into a checkbook was dead. In her place stood the queen of a new empire, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't hiding in the shadows. I was the one controlling them.